So, good afternoon, good morning. Hello, everybody around the world. Welcome to our Google Hangout as part of the massive open online course, One Ocean, One Planet. Today, we'd like to welcome you on a session that is concerning itself with what I think is a wonderful opportunity for the international ocean community. The United Nations has proclaimed a decade of ocean science for sustainable development. And in this Google Hangout, we have with us two experts. So my name is Martin Risbeck. I work at GEOMA from the Helmholtz Center for Ocean Research. And you probably have seen some of my comments and some of my lectures in the MOOC. And with us is Anna Sivian. She works for the Ocean Conservancy. She's based in the US, and she is certainly an ocean expert, ocean scientist, but also works in ocean advocacy and is as excited as I am about the decade. But we're also very pleased to have Peter Horgan from the Bergen University with us. He's also the president of the Intergovernmental Oceanographic Commission. It's headquartered in Paris. And Peter is actually probably the go-to place for what is happening with the decade of ocean science for sustainable development. And I'm going to hand over the mic to Peter now, and we're going to try to make his system work that we can see some slides. So Peter's going to give you a 10-minute introduction to the UN Ocean Decade, and then we're going to have a conversation answering your questions about what we think are the opportunities about that decade. So over to you, Peter.
Thank you very much, Martin. It's a pleasure to be here and to join this group. As you said, I have been working to promote the role of ocean science for sustainable development, and I have prepared a little PowerPoint. I'll see now if I can make that work for you all to describe what this decade is all about. Let's see. Can you see my some PowerPoint now?
Yes, we see the overview. If you put it on full screen, I think it should be fine.
Does it look like it now? A vision for the decade?
It's not full screen, Peter, but we can see the small screen.
It's full screen with here at my end. But
you're still in slide sorter view on our end, so if you go to slideshow, it should work.
Yes, I am in slideshow mode here now, but I may want to go back to the sharing screen again. Let's see. Little bit odd that it doesn't come up the same way for you as it does for me.
So Peter, you take your time, sort of the technicalities. So let me just, while Peter is working on his infrastructure, tell you a little bit about why we're having this hangout. So in the course, in the MOOC, we've been talking quite a bit about the various opportunities that ocean science has to offer for the ocean agenda, for sustainable development in the marine space. It's certainly in the MOOC, we're working with all of you to get, first of all, a little bit of background about ocean science in general, the various opportunities, how we learn about the ocean, how we observe the ocean, how we discover the ocean, but also about various forms of how we use the ocean. And in the engagement segment that Olga and many others have been organizing, it's also thinking about how we can come to a better relationship between us humans and the ocean. And I think it's in exactly that space how we can connect the knowledge systems that we have developing in the ocean science community with the solutions around ocean. And so, Peter, we can see you now, again, the camera, but can you try to share your screen one more time? And so I think while we still have Peter working on his slides, I'm going to, okay, we see all the slides. Maybe you just make them bigger, Peter. Can you make them bigger?
I can, certainly.
Still sort of you.
Yes.
Yeah. I think that's fine. I think with that we can certainly work for this chat. So why don't you just do it like that? And I think we can see the slide very well. Now it's small again.
Yeah, I guess.
Yeah. So I think that's perfect. So why don't you take over from here?
Okay. Thank you, Martin. Yes. So we have. When the Agenda 2030 was adopted by the United Nations General Assembly in late 2015, some of us thought that this was a splendid opportunity to see how we can contribute from ocean science and related activities, ocean observations, ocean services, data sharing, capacity building, and so on, to this actually crucially important event or opportunity that the Agenda 2030 actually offers us. So we said, you know, a decadal timescale is really enough, I think, to be able to muster the resources of the ocean science community and to really make a difference. And there are many things we'd like to do. So we put some initiatives together. We brought it up at this IOC, the Intergovernmental Oceanographic Commission that I chair, which has 150 member states, and we all are interested in ocean matters and ocean science, and got their approval. And then we had a process to bring it to the United Nations General Assembly, and we're very, very pleased when, a little bit less than a year now, it was actually proclaimed to be happening from 2021 to 2030. And we are now in a 2-year planning process then to get this going. So what I'm going to present to you now is some work still in progress on how we can set up this decade, how we can make it happen. So everything you see now might be changed in the next 2 years, but it's where we are and how we think we can do it. So it has to do with scientific knowledge, infrastructure, and partnerships for a sustainable, healthy ocean. This is not only about Sustainable Development Goal 14, which has to do with the ocean and avoiding illegal fishing and pollution and so forth. It has to do with a lot more how the ocean can contribute to many of the other Sustainable Development Goals. So we have a couple of societal outcomes that we talk about. And I'm going to go through them quickly, that this might lead to. We need a clean ocean. How can we, by science, contribute to that? We need a healthy and resilient ocean. And you see maybe on the right side, you see some of the other Sustainable Development Goals to which this is relevant. And you will see that they populate each of these societal outcomes. And a predicted ocean, you know, short-term prediction for tropical cyclones, tsunami warning, which is an area that we are strongly into, but also a seasonal scale and longer-term climate prediction would be of immense value to humanity, for agriculture, for many of the activities that we need to be doing. And then a safe ocean. Again, human lives, human livelihood is depending on our ability to make sure that activities on the ocean, marine transport, fisheries, etc., is happening in a safe way. Sustainable and productive ocean. You probably know that 50% of the world's primary production takes place in the ocean, but a much smaller fraction than that of the global food production comes from the ocean. It's likely that we need to get even more from the ocean. How can we do that if we degrade the possibilities of ocean ecosystems to support even the food production that we have today? What is the best way to get around this? I happen to think that we need to be more active in the ocean, not less active, to have a sustainable future for the whole globe, for the planet. And then we really need to make sure that these ecosystems are productive and effective. And then we have the final one, transparent and accessible ocean, a shared ocean, transparent in the sense that we all know what is going on there. We all can see through, we can all share data and information. And even if you're not an ocean scientist, you can maybe go there. The next slide is probably too busy for you to read all the small print. And I'm not showing it because I thought you would do so, but I just want to say the way we are thinking with how this can go about is, you see on the left, contributions to global targets. The small print here is the various SDGs, how they relate to these outcomes, these 6 outcomes I've just presented. And you will see that there are many different SDGs here which relates to each of them. And then we have also a set of R&D, research and development priority areas, which I haven't even gone through, like mapping of the ocean, like early warning systems for hazards, observing system for all ocean basins, inventory of the ecosystems. There's so much we don't know about the ocean that we need in order to be able to, for example, predict it and to harvest well from it. And information and data that support this. So how these linkages build together. And then we have on the very right the type of activities and programs that we need to develop, like a polar observing system, like a seafloor mapping program, which is already well underway in its planning, which will be a contribution to this decade. So that's how we are, to flesh out this in more detail, is what we have a process for now, regionally oriented as well as on global priorities, to get not only the scientists, but the representatives of governance, even industries, and civil society, to set out, flesh out in more detail what is the best way we can do this and how can we get that to happen. So what do we think we can achieve? Well, we certainly need a better map of the entire ocean floor and the ecosystems in there. Ocean literacy is a word I haven't mentioned up to now, but to make sure that the world at large really understands what the ocean is, how it's working. We are terrestrial animals, humankind, and we have a difficulty in understanding, for example, ecosystems which penetrate the entire ocean depth, where it's not only a 2-dimensional habitat, but it's really a 3-dimensional habitat, and how that is working. Get some of these ocean literacy principles and messages which have been, the community has agreed upon, get that to the public at large in all countries. And certainly for this we need observing systems. So we believe that this can be applied to a lot of societally useful things in the coastal zone, for fisheries, making sure that all the countries have their own strategies set towards these common goals. Marine spatial planning, how to develop a blue economy, how to get the various sectors together. All of these difficult things which science in isolation cannot deal with, but a science in close interaction with society, with decision makers, with governance and regulation can do. There are also things like nationally determined contributions to climate, like we talk now about blue carbon, how we can take up carbon in the coastal zone, for example, which is part of this, and many of these discussions will benefit from science, better science and shared science. And of course, capacity development and so forth. Marine protected areas, we have a lot of talk about the percentage of the area to be marine protected area. Now, what does that mean? What is the qualitative nature of marine protected areas? How can we make sure that when we designate the marine protected areas, it is not destroyed by some bigger things happening like global ocean acidification or other impacts? And how do we make these work so that they actually help the productivity, for example, and the use of resources from the ocean? Ocean policies, warning systems, etc. I'm excited by this decade, and I think many people in the science community are excited. We have had a lot of people from all over the world wanting to contribute to the planning process, and we are setting up the structures to do this in the UN system. But I want to emphasize that this is much beyond the UN system. It's a UN decade because it's been proclaimed at the UN. But in order to be successful, we really need to get these various players to work together, to define it, to get it off on the ground, to have engagement, and to have it steered into the priorities. So it's about science towards common goals, and that's why it's so important to be able to spread the word and to discuss it and have use the time to define it properly. So I think maybe I should stop at this point and allow for some discussion. Let's see.
Martin, we don't hear you.
So thank you, Peter, for the wonderful introduction to the decade. I think you made it very clear what the decade is all about. And I would actually like now to give Anna an opportunity as a first reaction. So how do you feel about the UN decade? Where do you see opportunities for us in research? And what are your questions for Peter? Maybe how to engage with the decade? So over to you, Anna. Maybe you can say a few words who you are, what connects you to the ocean community, and then have a few comments about the opportunities of the decade, and then we can elaborate on that. Over to you.
Super, and I'm very excited. Thank you for letting me participate. And I have a lot of thoughts, so I'm going to try to formulate them into a reasonable order. But first, just to introduce myself, I'm Senior Research Fellow at Ocean Conservancy, which is an environmental non-governmental organization based in the United States. We work on a range of issues with about 6 focus areas, some of which are international and some of which are US based. We work in the Arctic, and we have a trash-free seas program that are both quite international. We're working on ocean climate change issues, so many of the things Peter just discussed are relevant. And then we also work in California and in the Gulf of Mexico on restoration and on fisheries issues in the US, regionally in the US, and to some extent internationally as well. I also serve with Martin on the Ocean Knowledge Action Network development team. And in that role, I'm also incredibly interested in the decade and understanding how the ocean community writ large can contribute to the decade. As Peter said, I think the decade is really comes at a critical juncture. It's very important. This next 10 years is a really important time globally to address anthropogenic impacts on the entire planet, and in particular on the ocean. And I think this offers us in the ocean community and beyond an opportunity to understand how all of these issues link together, to fill gaps in knowledge where they exist, to fill gaps in institutional structures where they exist. My personal background is very much in the social sciences and particularly in the interactions among scales, from local government to subnational government, national government, and international. And I think the decade has a number of different ways for all of those scales to engage, and is an opportunity to bring them together. I'm also particularly interested in this interaction between science and society that Peter highlighted. And I think the decade, I really appreciate the focus that it's not just science in a vacuum, because there is no such thing, but it's really explicit about the interactions between science and societal needs, goals, cultures. And so what I think one of the opportunities I'd like to explore a little bit more, and maybe Peter can talk about this to some extent, is how civil society, the public, governments, and non-academic scientists can engage in the decade. And I think you've mapped out a few ways and are still working some of these questions out. But I'd like to understand, how some of these engagements, and how the boundaries between, the sort of tied together boundaries among science and society and political entities and institutions can come together during the decade. So I'll leave it there, but would love to speak further about that as well.
Peter, are you prepared to answer some of those questions? So I'd like to give it over to you.
Thank you, Martin, and thank you, Anna, for these comments. Yes, indeed, the links to society are crucial here. From the science community, sometimes when we talk to the science community, they emphasize that curiosity-driven science and the free flow of ideas and development of science-led initiatives is the best way to proceed to get new knowledge. And I think certainly for some of the many unknowns in the ocean, things that we don't know, things we need to know better in order to be able to manage the ocean, this is still a valid model. But time is short. We have to act. We have to not only produce science results by 2030, we have to produce science results as we go along that can be used for decisions and for societal actions and for industry and so on. Every year, decisions have to be made. If we don't have science at the table, science information to be shared, I'm quite convinced that the decisions made at intergovernmental level, for example, will be poorer. And if only some nations have the knowledge about, for example, which resources are out there in the international waters and others don't, we may not reach to any decision or agreement at all. Sometimes we're asked about, do we need science or do we need action? And I think the answer here is, well, we need action on the things where we can do action, and then we need to have the science so that the later actions are based on even better science. And I think when I talk to ocean scientists, I find that this is something that most of them understand and accept. Ocean scientists, the way I perceive it, they also care about the ocean. It may be different than other fields, but they're really into making the ocean work, making it better. So I'm optimistic that we can do this, but we have to make sure that we get the communication right, and that we get the different, not only the different disciplines together, which is always difficult, but to get this willingness to engage with both decision makers and the other actors in the ocean space. I think also we say ocean science for sustainable development. Policy decisions that are made, about the terrestrial activities, about humankind, things we do on land, also affect the ocean. So in fact, ocean science here in this context should be very broadly interpreted. Science that can inform policy, for example, for reducing pollution from land, making sure that we don't do bad things on land which affect the ocean, is also part of this. And I don't know if you've talked about plastic in this course so far, but I mean, this is one area where we have a lot of attention these days, and willingness to act is very big. And we also, I think, urgently need to make sure that we have the science right, how to deal with the plastics problem in the ocean, and what are the alternatives on shore. And there could be other issues which are equally important, but not so much on the agenda, like ocean acidification, which is a much longer term thing. How can we make sure that we get the science across to the public about this in a way that leads to actionable results? So this is this urgency here, and we require scientists and science-interested people who can engage in these various interesting but challenging interfaces. So for a start, but let's keep on.
Yes, thank you, Peter, for that. I think that's certainly quite insightful. Indeed, plastic has been part of the MOOC last week, and we had a Google Hangout about solutions in the plastic space. We heard from a number of NGOs in Africa, but also in Indonesia, who are working on beach cleanups, who are thinking in the community about what to do to address the plastic problem. So my question to you would be, as we plan out the decade, as we develop some activities, it's only, as you said, going to start in 2021. Do we plan also to engage knowledge from non-academic communities? That is, from the communities out there, from people who are actively working, say, with the fishing community, with the local municipalities on the plastic issue, but also with these groups. Do they have an opportunity to become part of the decade, and how is that planned and set up to be? So maybe you can elaborate a little bit on that, because quite a few of our MOOC viewers are from that category, from that part of our ocean family.
Yeah, I think this is a opportunity and development which is quite new to many ocean scientists. How do we engage the public, and how can we make use of new technology for the public, like, you know, apps, using your mobile phone, taking photographs of the coastal zone, for example. I think there's a lot of opportunities there to engage and to document the situation, for example. And this is an example of an area where, you know, maybe not the classical well-respected oceanographers in classical institutions, whom we also need, but who have been working with the classical ways of describing the ocean, may not be the ones who lead. I mean, this is a window of opportunity for initiatives and for various groups in the science society interface to engage. I think the formalities of how to be involved in this, I think, are getting perhaps less important as we move along here. The UN is a very formal body which makes decisions and proclaim a decade, for example. We don't want to go back there with every detail on how to engage the public in different parts of the world. We certainly see, when talking to people in countries which may not have a very strong classical ocean science tradition and groups, that there's a lot of useful experience and approaches here which actually predate the Agenda 2030, but have some of the same elements in them in sustainable development. The ways in which indigenous communities protected fisheries resources by making a temporary ban on some areas, because they learned from generations that this is a way to rebuild stocks, for example. So there's a lot of learning, I think, that can be done, experience that can be brought into this decade. Of course, these types of experiences are more local. They are typically not global, so we have the challenge of communicating the global challenge here. But I still think that there's a lot to be learned from indigenous, and I would say more than indigenous, local knowledge, irrespective of the people who are involved in this local knowledge. Respecting it and making sure that there's a home for that as well. And then once we get the regional processes going with the priorities, I think there will be avenues there. We will have regional workshops and so on. And we need to have those voices represented there. But, you know, these groups are maybe not the ones who are most important to bring to the formal bodies, but to more bring into the actual priorities and inputs as well as action.
So Anna, if I may get over to you, I mean, from an Ocean Conservancy perspective, your own organization, uh, you interact with scientists quite a bit. I mean, you would probably yourself, or also the organization says, yes, we're also a scientific organization, but you also have other agendas around ocean conservancy, around policy, around, dealing with the private and public sector. So what is exciting from your perspective about the decade? Is there any change that you would expect there, or is that something that the UN does but will not be impactful, or is that something that you and your colleagues feel exciting?
No, well, I think it's very tremendously exciting because it's an opportunity to bring this knowledge together, and I really appreciate that Peter noted the importance of local and traditional ecological knowledge and social knowledge as well. We, as I said, we're what you might call a boundary organization where we work at the policy and advocacy level. We work on science and in these multiple domains, and that's what it's going to take to bring ocean knowledge into solutions. And I think that's the goal of the decade. So it's really very much aligned with our mission as well. But any one organization isn't going to be able to do this by itself. And so I think the focus on partnerships and on ocean literacy and bringing in different types of knowledge is something that I'm very excited about. I'd note that there was a question on citizen science, and I think that citizen science could comprise a very big component of the knowledge base that's brought into the decade. There are a number of citizen science projects that are ocean related that I think could be part of the overall science and knowledge input into the ocean decade. There are several around marine debris, for example. We at Ocean Conservancy have long run coordinated the International Coastal Cleanup, which has transitioned from a cleanup to more of a focus on understanding the nature of marine debris and plastics and how plastic deposition works, and then furthermore, what are the scientific knowledge gaps that we need to fill around ocean plastics. So it's a combination of bringing in citizen science efforts in terms of understanding what types of trash make it to the beach, for example, where they're coming from, how long they take to degrade, things like that, combined with the academic science inputs to get a better understanding to be able to drive the solutions. So I think at Ocean Conservancy, we're very excited about it. I think bringing these boundary organizations can help build the needed partnerships to really help the ocean decade succeed.
So Anna, thank you for pointing out, and Peter, you mentioned that before as well, that certainly another dimension of the decade, you mentioned, Peter, ocean observing, you mentioned international coordinated ocean science, but we also heard about ocean literacy. And in particular, this massive open online course, you could say, is a piece of ocean literacy. It's about global learning. It's about getting the community together, sharing their best practices, their ideas, how they can come up with what I sometimes call a better human-ocean relationship. And I'd just like to see how we would imagine rolling this out. Would there be some formats, maybe some online conferences that the decade would organize, or would there be some factual material organized to be shared around the globe? Would there be something maybe around fundraising or shared fundraising for some solution products? I mean, do you have any idea how that might shape up or might materialize itself? Or is it for the community to self-organize and just put a logo on there and that's a contribution to the decade? I think some of our learners might have some very concrete questions on how they could become part of it. Will there be a youth movement maybe around the decade? So things like that, I think some of our listeners and learners might be quite interested in.
Yeah, those are a lot of good points, Martin. I think, first of all, we've never done this before. We have a lifetime opportunity to do this decade. We're not going to have another chance. So we have to accept all good ideas for how to do it in the best possible way. I mean, that's the number one message. We don't have a recipe, and invite input to how to do it. I think youth, certainly, not only young leaders, but the youth and the young scientists as well are maybe a key to this, to success. Some of us, like myself, have been in ocean science for several decades and will be around, hopefully, also by the end of the decade. But this is for the future. This is for the next generations, and to bring them in is really crucial here. The ways in which to do it is, as I try to, it's open, I think. We certainly see the value of, for example, online information to create awareness and interest. You can show the problems, the difficulties. You can also show fascination for the many unknowns and poorly known aspects of the ocean. I was in the US earlier this week and saw a live shot from a US research vessel at 2,000 meter depth. They're showing live streaming of the marine life you see down there. They also find some debris on the seafloor in these areas. And for people to really understand the scale of these problems, but also the possibilities, I think these kind of opportunities we have for live picture information is something we need to build upon, also in raising awareness and interest from the public at large. There are many opportunities there which we are only beginning to capitalize on. But they can emerge very quickly. That's the point, that the technology allows us to use this very quickly. We are doing a Google Hangout now. 10 years ago, when nobody would do anything like that, and there are these kinds of opportunities, connectivity, which we need to capitalize on, and discussion forum and bringing good practices, using social media, all kinds of things which were not in the repertoire or arsenal that we have some years ago. I think this is a challenge for all of us, how to organize in a proper way. Yes, we need to sort of make some criteria for putting a mark on activities that they actually contribute to the decade. We cannot let this completely loose. The UN has experience now with what is called voluntary commitments. The UN Ocean Conference last year in New York invited voluntary commitments. There were more than 1,000 voluntary commitments. They have been grouped into various categories. There is a follow-up of that. There is something we can learn from that. I don't think we can and should copy it completely, because it becomes a bit loose. It's a good way to sort of mobilize involvement and have initiatives brought to the table. But we need to do, I think, a little bit more stronger follow-up of these activities that we have in the decade. And we don't want, actors to go out and say that with this little greenwash of our activities, we are a contributor to sustainable development. There's a danger there always, that we get players on board that we don't want to emphasize. So we have a bit of a work there. I think this is a work for the scientists, the science competence to make sure that we see who is on board and who is not the main player. But at the outset, we invite all contributions, and we are seeing interest from philanthropists. We are seeing interest from industry as well to really contribute significantly. And I think that's going to be important as well, that we get that right.
So Anna, if I may, so this looks very and sounds very promising to me. I'm even more excited now, Peter, than but I've always been actually. But I believe, I mean, Anna comes also from not just the science world, but also from the civil society world. From where you come from, Anna, what would be something that you would throw out and say, if I had one wish for the decade, sort of for my community, what would that be? Just I think, it might well be that Peter can throw such an idea to the group that's going to organize the decade. It might be taken up. So anything that you would say, Anna, from your point of the world, from where you look at it and say, oh, if the decade did that thing or solved that issue or brought that forward, that would really make it exciting or interesting for the Science Plus community. Over to you, Anna.
You gave me a really easy question there, Martin, because there's a number of things that I think could be useful. First, I think identifying, well, the thing that I think is most important is continuing this recognition that this isn't just about natural science questions, but that the questions need to be linked to issues and decisions that we're going to make to ensure, a healthy ocean functioning ocean. And so I think one of the most important things that the decade can do is bring in decision makers and figure out, derive the best ways for decision makers to engage in the decade, to be aware of the decade. And that's something that civil society can help with, but I think should be a focus so that this doesn't become a science exercise in isolated from society. And I think you've already made a really good start at that, and that's part of why I'm really excited about it. But that's a key item. The other thing is identifying and filling the knowledge gaps that will help motivated decision makers make better decisions, because I think we know that the knowledge deficit model doesn't work. That is, just presenting good science won't guarantee good decisions, but presenting the good science to people who are motivated to make the decisions for societal reasons, that does make a difference. So those are the two of the really important areas I see.
Thanks, Anna. We have a question from one of the viewers, and he asks us, and maybe Peter, I'm going to ask you to respond. Well, how can all maritime countries work jointly for the protection of the ocean? So I really think he's asking the question now, how can we use the decade to join up forces, or is that the idea of the decade?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think there are several components to the answer, but certainly one of them is to make sure that we share all the information that we have, that all the countries get access to the information. We have a long-range transport of pollution. We have ecosystems that span the economic zones of the various countries. That is well known. We have climate change that leads to fisheries moving from one nation to another. In some regions of the world, there have been regional collaboration that is actually working reasonably well in terms of fisheries. And I think there are lessons to be learned from those good examples that we have. We should bring those up as a learning experience. Because many of these things have regional solutions, and some have also a need for a global action, like the international waters beyond national jurisdiction and some of these issues with the large marine ecosystems. How will they work jointly to protect the oceans? They need to be at the table at some of these intergovernmental bodies. We need to make sure that all the countries in a region affected by some problem have access to the right information. This is a role for science. and we need to make sure that their voice is heard, and that they can then find the best solutions. Very often we see, for example, from fisheries, which is maybe the area where we have most experience, that a certain fisheries resource, which is typically shared between different nations, it will be best managed if it is harvested, in a different. If it is harvested maybe more in one country's economic zone than equally spread between them, it's better for everybody, for the type of harvest we can do and the economic output. But if we don't work together, then there will be damaging competition. The tragedy of the commons is often used about the ocean, because everybody works on their own interest and don't see the whole picture. So this is a thing that requires the governments to be well informed, the government to trust each other, and it requires them to build upon scientific and knowledge, common knowledge, to the decisions that has to be made. Not everybody get to the table with their own separate knowledge or science information, but they get to the table with a shared science information. That's, I think, where I think we can contribute to the decade to get these right for a whole range of both global and regional processes.
Very good, Peter. We have one more question from a participant, and then I'm going to invite Olga to give us a suggestion as an early career scientist of the key item that the decade needs to do. So one of the listeners says, do we need to wait until 2030 to see the first results, or is there a possibility that something can be done early?
Yeah.
So can I just throw in quickly, I'm sure we're going to say the same thing, which is that absolutely things will be done throughout the decade. It's a full decade of ocean science, and I think part of the goal is to share the latest scientific knowledge as it comes up, and to have a place where people know that they can go for that scientific knowledge. So it's starting even now, before the decade officially begins. I think the inputs to it, the way that people can get involved, are already happening. There are going to be a series of meetings. Peter can probably talk more about that throughout that decade. So absolutely it can start first. And I wanted just quickly to say, in terms of the joint, countries working jointly, I think Peter noted there are a bunch of regional compacts that already exist. I'd say the Arctic Council is a really good example of a place where countries that may not always have the same, may not always act together closely politically in other contexts, are working really closely together on ocean issues. Russia, the US, Canada, Norway are all really collaborative in that forum. I think also very important is making sure that the ocean is a big part of international agreements that already exist. So the one that I'm most closely working on is the UNFCCC on climate change, and the ocean is starting to be recognized as a critical element there. I think, engaging for countries, engaging in those efforts, that's one place where they can work together to highlight the importance of the ocean and to work closely together on ocean protection.
Thanks, Anna. That was, I think, a perfect answer for that. And I'm sure Peter would have said the same thing. So I think we're good for that. So Olga, can I maybe get you engaged for the last 5 minutes here? And from you as an early career scientist, being involved in various ocean types of issues from science, but also as an entrepreneur. So what is it that you find exciting about the decade, or something that you want to throw at Peter and Anna and maybe myself to pursue as we are trying to develop that decade? Over to you, Olga.
Thank you, Martin. Well, I just, to be very brief, I just have 2 thoughts for the decade, something that I would like to see happening. As you mentioned, I'm combining science and entrepreneurship because I feel it's important to act, and that's the way I see action too. First off, I would say that it would be great to have a lot of, as Anna just mentioned, collaboration and collaborative effort, because as I see, and I'm quite sure I'm not alone here, the ocean challenges are very multidimensional. It's not really efficient to, for instance, if I'm a biologist or as an environmental scientist, I do not see a lot of the picture. So if I collaborate with, I don't know, economists, lawyers, people from early career scientists or more advanced scientists from other fields, then the chances that we will arrive at some sort of a solution or a intermediary solution would be much higher. So that's, if we create, I would love to see more opportunities for such collaboration, happening on an international stage as well as national, of course. And secondly, probably also more opportunities to link science with action would be great, because that's something that concerns early career scientists I've spoken to, and as the ones that I'm representing right now, that a lot of fundamental science is happening and applied science as well, but not too much action is, there could have been more outcome. And I know that's the concern that especially young people share, that they want to see more action there. So if we think of, and of course, it's up to the young people themselves to also think how this can happen and not just, think this would be a great thing to have. But if we have more kind of these opportunities to link science and action, that would be wonderful. Then I would say, in my personal opinion, the decade, you could say that it will have been very efficient.
Thank you, Olga. That is a great intervention. Now I'm going to give Peter a chance to say one or two words before we will close this Google Hangout. So Peter, you like those suggestions, some that resonates with you, and how are we going to make sure that they enter into the planning thinking?
I certainly like those points. And in fact, science for ocean action is a word I've been involved in using now. There are other initiatives. There's a high-level panel on building a sustainable ocean economy, chaired by the Norwegian Prime Minister, which is looking for advice. And they have a lifetime between now and 2020. So they like to have actions, proposed more or less on the spot. And I really like that. And I like us to bring up those things. It will be extremely useful for the decade that we have some cases where we show that the distance between science and action is actually quite short. And as I mentioned earlier, people have to act. People act in the ocean every day. If they do it not based on science, then the chances are that the decisions and the actions will be not so good as they could have been. So getting things that we can show that science helps right now and in the next few months and years is, I think, again, going to be crucial in magnifying the impact and efforts that we can do throughout the decade. And certainly having an impact as we go along is a key to the success here. All the time, think about how what we do can contribute to better decisions and better activities related to the ocean, and making sure it contributes to sustainable development as a whole. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Peter. Thank you, Anna, and also Olga, for contributing to this Google Hangout. I think we had a wonderful exchange of views. We had some good questions and suggestions from the audience. We had a few technical difficulties at the beginning, but I think we surmounted them as always wonderfully. The Google Hangout will be available to all the viewers also on offline viewing. So thanks again for making the time in your busy calendars, in particular Peter and Anna and Olga. And over to you, listeners. Come back to the MOOC and send us questions in. We can also answer them on the forum. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Bye.